In this lesson, we are going to be looking at translating numerical expressions. And what that means is we're going to be looking at words that we will read or that we will come across that will let us know what operation we are doing. Are we going to add, subtract, multiply, or divide? So if you're taking this class, you'll want to copy off your notes. And in your notes, we're going to give you some words that you can write down that you can be looking for. Now, if we were in class today, we'd be brainstorming these, but it's hard to brainstorm on a video, so I'm just going to have to give them to you. So on your notes, words that refer to addition, if you think about that, we can use the phrase, the sum of. The sum is the answer to an addition problem. Now, when we use this phrase, the sum of, whatever we're writing down, we're going to have to put it in parentheses. It changes the order of operations, and we're going to look at that here in just a little bit. So write down the sum of as one of the phrases that refers to addition. Next, we have the phrase greater than. That also will tell you that you're going to add. More than. 4 more than 2 would be 6. So that tells us that we are going to add. Next we have plus. That's pretty obvious because it's a plus sign. And increase. If you increase your salary by $10, then that is going to be adding to your original salary. So all of these phrases or words are going to show you that you're going to be adding. Next, let's look at subtraction. What are some phrases or words that are going to tell us that we're going to subtract? First one is difference, because the answer to a subtraction problem is the difference. The difference between 10 and 6 is 4. Another word would be minus, which is pretty obvious because we use the minus sign for subtraction. Less than. Notice I put little asterisks here around the phrase less than, because something's going to happen when you use this phrase. It's a special phrase. If I say 3 less than 5, if you think about what that's saying, you want 3 less than 5, which means you're taking 3 away from 5. So when you write it down, you're actually going to reverse the order, because we want 3 less than 5. So when you see this phrase, whatever number you see first is actually going to come last when you write it. Because when you think about it, that's the way it has to be. So that's going to be a special phrase we'll have to look for. To decrease, we're going to subtract. If the temperature outside decreased by 5 degrees, you would subtract 5 from the original temperature. Fewer than is another phrase where we're going to have to look at something special, so I put asterisks around that. Okay, let's move on to words that would refer to multiplication. The first one would be product, because the answer to a multiplication problem is the product. So if I said the product of 2 and 7, I would write 2 times 7. The product is the answer to a multiplication problem. Of. Of is a word that I know it's a preposition in English class, but when you hear of in math class, you have to think of multiplication. Next we have times, which is obvious because the multiplication sign is, we often say 3 times 5. 3 groups of 5. By is another word. If you have a piece of paper that's 8 by 11, you would multiply those two to find out what the area of that paper would be. Double. If you read double, you know that you're specifically going to be multiplying times 2. If it says triple, I don't know that that one's up here, you know specifically that you're going to be multiplying times 3. If you say quadruple, you know you're going to be multiplying times 4. So there are some words that let you know specifically what you're going to be multiplying by. Now let's look at words that refer to division. Okay, so first we have quotient, because the answer to a division problem is called the quotient. So the quotient of 10 and 2 would be 5, which means the answer. Per. if I said that, let's see, a dozen eggs is $2 per dozen, that means they're $2 for 12. So we would take 2 and divide by 12 to find the cost of one egg. Divided by is pretty obvious. If it uses the phrase divided by, you're going to divide. Half means that you're specifically going to divide by 2. Separate equally is another phrase that lets you know you're going to take the number and divide. So I hope you've been taking notes and that you're writing these words down so that you can refer back to them. Now let's see how we're going to use this. We're going to look at a numerical expression and we are going to translate it. That means that we're going to write it with numbers and operational signs. So if we read 3 times the sum of 21 and 12, we're just going to start reading. We see a 3, so we're going to write 3 times, we're going to multiply. Now, this is the multiplication sign that you use when you're in elementary school, maybe 6th grade. But you need to begin to get rid of this sign. Kind of an in-between sign that we use is a dot. And maybe you've seen a dot like this. That means 3 times. Boy, that's messy, isn't it? 3 times. What we're really going to do when we get to algebra is we're going to get rid of that sign altogether. And the multiplication sign is going to be understood. So you're going to see it both ways. I'm going to show it both ways for you so you can get familiar with it. So I'm going to use 3 times, I'm going to use the dot, the sum of. There's that special phrase that when we see it, we know we're going to add and that the numbers have to be in parentheses. 3 times the sum of 21 and 12. So we add those two numbers. Now what happens when we do order of operations is we always do multiplication before addition, but when we use this set of parentheses, it changes the order in which we evaluate it. That's why those parentheses are important. So when we read 3 times the sum of 21 and 12, you could write 3 times the sum of 21 and 12, or you could leave the dot off altogether, and because there is no sign here, we understand it to be multiplication. Okay, Tom has one set of 6 socket wrenches. His collection was increased by 2 sets of 8. So Tom has one set of 6 sockets. How many sockets would that be? That would be 6. His collection was increased, which means to add, by 2 sets of, there's one of the words that we talked about, 2 sets of 8. So how many sockets, if you have 2 sets and each set has 8 sockets, that would be 16 sockets altogether. Now we're not solving, we're translating. So write the numerical expression for this. 6 increased by 2 sets of 8. So we have 6 increased means to add, and 2 sets of 8 would be 2 times 8. And if you want to get rid of the multiplication sign, you would write it like this. You would say 6 increased by 2 times 8. I put one of those in parentheses just so it won't look like the number 28. And there's no operational sign, so we understand that to be multiplication. We're not solving, we're just translating. Okay, so here's practice. This is on your notes, so you can look there as well. 3 less than. Now you remember the phrase less than, we had little stars, asterisks by, because if we want 3 less than something, that's going to actually be at the end of our equation because we're going to take 3 away from whatever we started with. The product of, we know that tells us to multiply. What are we going to multiply? 4 and 9, and that's going to become at the beginning. So 4 times 9 comes be first. If you're more comfortable, you can write the dot in between them. But at the end, we have the 3 less than. So remember that phrase less than, that comes at the end when we write it. So when we write it, it would be 4 times 9 minus 3. 7 more than, do you remember the phrase more than? That tells us that we're going to add. So we have 7 more than the doubled sum of. Okay, so we have doubled. Do you remember what we said we were going to do when it says doubled? We're going to multiply times 2. But then the sum of, remember, we have this in parentheses. So here's the sum of 5 and 3 in parentheses, but we want that doubled, so we're going to multiply it times 2. So we put a 2 out in the front. Now, if you feel better, you can put a dot there, which means 2 times the sum of 3 plus 7. Or you can leave the dot out. 15 less than. Again, here's this phrase less than. So we want 15 at the end because whatever it is, we're going to take away 15 from it. The double of 10. Remember, double means we're going to multiply times 2. So we would have 10 times 2, and then we subtract the 15. 15 less than 10 times 2. 1/2, remember that means we're going to divide by 2. When we divide by 2, we can just use our division bar like this. We're going to divide it by 2. The sum of, there's that phrase, the sum of, so we know this is going to be in parentheses, 25 plus 5. So we can either write it with the division bar like this, or you can write it 25 plus 5, the sum of those two, divided by 2. But you'll have to put the divided by 2 at the end. 8 times, well that's pretty obvious, 8 times, or we can leave the dot out, the sum of, remember that tells us immediately that we're going to put a parentheses, and we're going to add what numbers together? 9 and 3. So you can write it with or without the dot, which means to multiply. Dum, da, dum. Dum, dum. All right, the sum of. Here again is the phrase the sum of. So we know that this is going to be in parentheses. 15 and 6. So the sum of, as soon as I read that phrase, I write my parentheses and put my plus sign. The sum of 15 and 6 decreased by, decreased, if you look back at your list, means to subtract, decreased by 3. The next one we have the sum of, again, the sum of, we write parentheses, put our plus sign, the sum of 5 and 7 minus 2. Pretty straightforward on that one. 3 times the number that is 4 minus 1/2. Let's think about this again. 3 times the number that is 4 minus 1/2. Or when you're going 1/2, you could just do divide by 2. So you could write it like this, or you could divide by 2. There's 1/2. 3/4, so we have the fraction 3/4 times 3 minus 2. That one was very straightforward. 3 times the number, so 3 times the number, that is 4 minus 1/2. So again, that one's pretty straightforward. 4 minus 1/2. So here's what we looked at. These are the words. If I were in class today, I'd be leaving this up on the screen so that you can look at them. You can refer to your notes, but use that as you are translating your numerical expressions today. You do not have to solve them. You are just translating. Good luck.